On a crisp October morning, Walter sat on his cushioned lawn chair, sipping coffee and watching the oak leaves dance in the breeze, until Margaret Ellington marched up with her clipboard. The porch creaked beneath the slow rock of his chair. The autumn light filtered through the oak's broad branches, painting gold across the porch floor. A rustle overhead brought down a soft sprinkle of leaves, twirling like dancers on cue. Walter watched them settle without urgency, letting the steam from his mug blur the line between thought and memory. From the kitchen, a gentle clatter of glass jars and the rhythmic stirring of cider sounded. Joanne's voice floated out a moment later, half laughing at something the cat had done, then pausing as she stepped to the window. "That tree's been here longer than she's been alive," she murmured, her voice carrying just enough for Walter to hear. He smiled, faintly. The tree had always stood like a sentinel, first through childhood summers, then homecoming winters, and now through HOA notices. It shaded the porch with quiet dignity, a kind of living clock no board could reset. The smile faded as he spotted Margaret's unmistakable stride up the walk. Stiff-backed, heels sharp on the concrete, she looked every bit the commander of clipboards. Her lipstick matched the maple leaves by design, and her blazer bore the HOA insignia as if it were a police badge. "Good morning, Mr. Harland," she said, all bright smile and clipped tone. "Enjoying the season, I hope?" Walter nodded slowly. "Always do. Especially the colors." Her eyes flicked upward toward the oak. "Yes. Vibrant. Also, messy." He said nothing. She drew a laminated sheet from her folder and offered it like a summons. "We've had several comments from residents about the debris. It's becoming a concern." He took the sheet and glanced at it. A friendly compliance reminder, printed in HOA blue with falling leaf motifs around the border, suggested immediate attention to seasonal yard management. Walter raised an eyebrow. "This is new." "We update quarterly," Margaret said smoothly. Section 4.3 outlines expectations for natural foliage containment. "We'd appreciate your prompt cooperation." She smiled again, as if handing over a tray of cookies rather than a warning. Joanne stepped onto the porch then, holding a steaming mug for Walter. She gave Margaret a once-over, then leaned against the post casually. "Morning, Margaret. Coming by to inspect the foliage?" Margaret didn't flinch. "Just issuing reminders." Joanne nodded. "Well, you picked the right porch. Walter's been raking since dawn. Didn't even break for lunch." Walter took the mug with a quiet thank you. Margaret's smile faltered slightly. She looked back at the tree. "If it's not trimmed by next Friday," she said, turning her gaze to Walter, "the board may escalate." He took a sip, his eyes on the oak. "Noted." With a nod that could cut granite, she turned and clicked back down the walk. That evening, the cider filled the house with spice and memory. Joanne had set out peppermint candies in the dish beside the radio and was thumbing through an old Reader's Digest when Walter emerged from the hallway carrying a photo album. He placed it on the table and flipped to a brittle page. There, under a crackled plastic sheet, was a black and white photo of his father beside a sapling, barely taller than his knees. "She'd planted this tree before Margaret even moved to Virginia," Walter said. Joanne leaned in, eyes soft. "He called it the peace tree, didn't he?" Walter nodded. "Said every house needs something rooted deeper than people's tempers." Outside, the neighborhood buzzed with fall. Across the street, families were setting out pumpkins. A cloth banner reading "Maple Falls Harvest Fair, October 20th, hung between lampposts. Somewhere, someone was stringing lights across a porch rail. Margaret's car passed by slowly. She didn't wave. Walter woke the next morning to find another envelope, this time tucked under the latch of his mailbox. He walked it inside, set it on the kitchen counter beside the peppermint dish, and peeled it open. Joanne flipped the paper and sees a highlighted line: "Failure to comply may result in assessment penalties." A second envelope arrived, this time with a fine for $75 and an attached photo of the oak's dangerous droppings. Walter opened it with the same slow care he gave his morning toast, using the tip of a butter knife instead of his finger. The photo had been printed in color, high gloss, an overexposed close-up of a pile of leaves, as if the tree had committed a misdemeanor in broad daylight. He squinted. The date stamp read yesterday afternoon. That explained the faint shutter sound he'd heard while sweeping the porch. Dangerous droppings, he muttered, setting the letter beside his coffee mug. Sounds like something from a bird sanctuary lawsuit. Joanne was at the counter, flipping through the comics section and laughing under her breath. She glanced over at the paper, then at Walter. $75 for seasonal behavior, she said. Should we bill the clouds next time it rains? Walter didn't answer right away. He just looked down at the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. The date for Domino Night, Callahan's, 7 p.m., had been circled in blue ink. Next to it, Joanne had doodled a tiny tree. He walked to the window, pulled back the curtain. The oak stood in perfect defiance, branches broad and brilliant in the morning light. A few leaves tumbled gently, landing on the driveway like well-behaved guests. Funny how a tree becomes a problem once someone decides it's not part of their plan, Walter said. The day moved slowly, as most good ones did. Around mid-morning, Walter and Joanne took their usual spot at the local diner. The windows steamed lightly from the cold outside, and the smell of bacon, cinnamon, and coffee drifted thick through the booths. Mandy, the waitress who'd been pouring coffee there since Reagan was in office, stopped by with a pot in one hand and a smile that didn't need faking. Same for you, Walt. Scrambled and rye. You know me. She leaned in slightly, voice low. Karen was in earlier. Took 4 napkins for a single muffin. Said something about prepping for showing day. You think she's selling? Joanne looked up, eyes bright. If she is, I'm sending flowers to the buyers. Walter just smiled politely. He didn't engage in gossip, but he certainly wasn't above listening. Back home that evening, the domino tiles clacked and slid across Callahan's kitchen table. The room smelled of wood polish and old cigars, and the coffee was the kind you had to stir with patience. Bev had brought over a tin of molasses cookies and sat at the far end, sipping slowly. It was near the third round when she leaned slightly toward Walter, speaking just under the hum of the ceiling fan. Word is, there's a push coming. Karen's trying to get the board to vote on mandatory foliage compliance. Trim or remove. You know. Aesthetics. Walter raised an eyebrow. You mean cut down what's been here longer than Maple Falls itself? Bev didn't answer directly. She's been passing out flyers at dawn. Not mailing them. Just sliding them under doors. Sounds sneaky, Joanne said. It's Margaret, Bev replied. Sneaky's a feature, not a bug. Later that night, Walter noticed a new sign planted beside the community bulletin board, Neighborhood Pride equals clean yards. It stood stark against the amber grass, the text a little too bold, the plastic a little too white for fall. Underneath the slogan, someone had taped a small note that read, "Don't let debris define us." He shook his head. When did leaves stop being part of fall? On his way back to the house, he passed Eli near the edge of their driveway. The boy had earbuds in, a hoodie pulled over tight, but he bent and picked up a single oak leaf, twirling it in his fingers before slipping it into his front pocket without a word. Walter watched him go, then stepped inside. The next morning, he dialed a number he'd not used in months. McNally here, a voice answered. It's Walter Harland. A pause. I figured you'd be calling. Let me guess, compliance citation. Something like that. Karen left another envelope. McNally sighed, long and slow. Look. I didn't support the new initiative. She pushed the vote through at the end of last month's meeting. Attendance was thin. Half of us didn't even know what we were signing. She's weaponizing procedure, Walter said flatly. McNally didn't argue. Yeah. But the board's nervous. She's got her eye on re-election, and she's been saying non-compliance equals neighborhood blight. Makes people think if they push back, property values will drop. That tree doesn't lower values. It raises them, Walter said. I know. Some of us know. Walter hung up without saying goodbye. That evening, as Joanne folded laundry on the porch and Walter filled the candy dish with fresh peppermints, Bev passed by with her dog and paused at the gate. "You didn't hear it from me," she said, "but rumor is she's selling her house. But she wants everything to look HOA perfect before she goes." While Karen measured sidewalk widths with a tape measure, Joanne was quietly texting her realtor friend. Walter watched the whole scene from the porch, one hand cradling his coffee, the other resting on the arm of his weathered lawn chair. Karen moved with exaggerated precision, lowering herself to the curb with more flair than function, drawing the measuring tape taut along the edge like she was charting coordinates for a lunar landing. "She's planning something," he murmured. "Of course she is," Joanne replied, not looking up from her phone. "But so are we." She typed with deliberate slowness, her face calm, but there was a twinkle in her eye. Her thumb hovered over the send button a moment longer than necessary before tapping it with quiet satisfaction. Down at the street, Karen stood and jotted something on a clipboard. She glanced up toward the porch but didn't wave. Instead, she moved to the next section of sidewalk, measuring again. "Why would anyone measure sidewalk width?" Walter asked. Joanne sipped her tea. "To find problems that don't exist. But sometimes, when someone looks too long at other people's yards, they forget to mind their own." They didn't speak of it further until later that afternoon, when Joanne stepped back inside and disappeared into the study. The sun crept across the porch, casting long shadows from the oak's branches, and Walter spent the next hour sweeping leaves that had gathered along the fence line. It was a quiet ritual, one he didn't mind. Eli passed by after school, earbuds dangling loosely around his neck. He stopped near the gate and glanced toward the tree. Walter looked up and gave a small nod. "Hey," Eli said, voice tentative. "Was the tree always there?" Walter rested the broom against the porch railing. "It was a lot shorter when I was your age." The boy took a few steps closer, eyes tracing the trunk upward. "Looks like it's always been here." Walter stepped inside and returned with an old photograph. It was faded at the corners, the colors softened with time. A teenage Walter stood beside his father, one hand on a newly planted sapling, both smiling with the kind of pride that came from hard work, not ceremony. "He planted it after the war," Walter said. "Said we'd need something that wouldn't flinch at a storm." Eli studied the photo, then looked up at the tree again. "Cool." He handed the picture back and walked on, but his steps were slower, more thoughtful. That evening, Joanne returned from her errand with a satisfied smirk. "She's listing," she said, dropping her purse on the bench. Marcy just texted back. "Karen's been quietly trying to sell since Labor Day. Wants to be gone before the first snow." Walter blinked. "She's never mentioned it." "She wouldn't. But it explains the sidewalk measurements and the sudden obsession with visual standards. She wants the neighborhood, and herself, looking perfect for showings." Walter rubbed the back of his neck. "We're not buying her house." Joanne didn't argue. She just reached for a peppermint from the dish and unwrapped it slowly. At the diner the next morning, Mandy slid 2 plates across the counter, scrambled eggs for Walter, rye toast for Joanne. "She's been in here griping about lowball offers," Mandy said, topping off their coffees. "Said one guy wanted to pay less than tax value. Then muttered something about undervaluing the spirit of the neighborhood. I nearly choked on my donut." Joanne sipped her coffee. "Sounds like someone's not getting the attention she wants." Walter nodded, quietly turning the sugar packet in his hand. His reflection shimmered in the stainless steel napkin dispenser. Later that afternoon, Joanne sat on the porch with her feet propped on the rail, watching the leaves tumble through beams of amber light. "Walt," she said, "what if we don't just win the argument?" He turned slightly, waiting. "What if we buy the battlefield?" He frowned. "You're serious?" She met his eyes. "As a power line inspection." They didn't speak for a while. A wind moved through the trees, and across the street, Karen was rearranging potted mums on her porch for the 3rd time that week. Walter watched her, then the tree, then Joanne. He exhaled slowly. That night, Marcy called. She's desperate to sell, she said. Already cut the asking price once. She just doesn't want the neighbors to know. Joanne, let's make an offer she won't recognize, until it's too late. Margaret was busy arranging her open house cookies, while Walter and Joanne signed the offer that would end her reign. In the sunlight of a late October morning, Karen hovered over her folding table like a general at war. The sugar cookies were lined in militant precision, each one topped with a pumpkin-shaped orange sprinkle, and her real estate flyer sat in a silver holder next to a tray of cider cups. Her Range Rover gleamed in the driveway, newly waxed, parked at just the right angle for admiration. Across town, in the quiet of Walter's kitchen, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paper. Joanne's glasses slid slightly down her nose as she reviewed the last page of the offer. Walter sat beside her, still in his denim work shirt, coffee untouched. She never bothers to read the small print, Joanne said as she signed. Lucky for us. Walter hesitated for only a moment before signing his name. He didn't smile. It wasn't about winning, it was about reclaiming peace. The papers slid into a neat manila envelope. Joanne tucked it under her arm like it contained apple pie recipes. Marcy greeted them at her office with a brisk nod and a mug of tea that read, "Trust me, I'm a closer." The blinds were half-drawn, filtering soft afternoon light onto her desk. She's been watching the listings like a hawk, Marcy said, scanning the documents. But she doesn't know who's behind this. I'll flag it anonymous, through the HOA intranet submission, just like you asked. Joanne nodded. Let's give her something to celebrate. Which she will, Marcy added, right until the name on the deed appears. Back at Maple Falls, Karen fluttered about her porch like a self-appointed hostess of suburban royalty. Eli leaned against the banister nearby, hands in his hoodie pockets, watching as his grandmother adjusted the bows on each sign stake and realigned a small welcome mat with surgical precision. Open house is going great, she chirped, not really speaking to him. Someone made an offer, very close to asking. I'm holding out hope. People want to live near elegance. Eli didn't respond. He eyed the bowl of individually wrapped mints like they might tell him something she wouldn't. Karen tapped the frame of her clipboard. Once I close, this neighborhood can finally get back to standards. Some folks forget this is a shared space, not a leaf sanctuary. He shifted his gaze to the street, where the last of the golden leaves drifted onto the sidewalk. Didn't know a tree could lower property values, he said softly. She snapped her fingers and pointed to the corner. Leaves become rot. Rot becomes blight. Blight brings down appraisal. Inside Marcy's office, the fax machine pinged. She retrieved the confirmation page with a small flourish. She accepted, she said. Didn't even counter. Joanne blinked. That was fast. She's under pressure to close before Thanksgiving, Marcy explained. She's worried the tree will lose all its leaves by then and make the front yard look worse. Walter let out a long breath. Not quite relief, but something gentler, like the wind quieting after a long gust. That evening, as he trimmed the edge of his porch shrubs, Eli appeared again, this time without earbuds. He lingered at the gate. Grandma says someone bought the house, he said, towing the gravel. Walter nodded. Yeah. Papers are signed. She's acting weird. Not excited. More twitchy. She's built her world on rules, Walter replied. Sometimes, a new door means giving up the key. The boy nodded slowly, glancing up at the oak. It swayed just slightly, regal as ever. Inside, Joanne poured cider into mismatched mugs, humming some forgotten song. She passed one to Walter as he stepped in, cheeks flushed from the chill. Delivery went smooth. She signed before reading, he said. Joanne grinned and leaned against the counter. You think she'll still want us to trim the tree when she's renting from the guy who owns her yard? Karen returned with another citation in hand. Walter answered the door with the deed. She didn't knock. Just marched up the steps like she was still queen of the cul-de-sac, waving her clipboard as if it had the weight of law behind it. Her coat flared with the wind, a dramatic rustle she clearly took as applause. Walter, who'd been watching her from the porch swing, rose slowly and opened the screen door. "This isn't a social call," she snapped. "The HOA has reviewed the ongoing situation with your oak tree and determined that further inaction constitutes willful defiance." Walter held up a thin folder. The edge caught the morning sun. "I figured," he said. "That's why I thought we should start with this." Karen blinked as he handed her the papers. The clipboard drooped slightly in her hand as she stared at the heading. The bold letters read, "Property transfer, finalized." Below that, her own signature. What is this?" she asked. "The deed," Walter said plainly. "To your former property." Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes flicked from the signature line to the notary seal, then back again. "That's impossible. I never." Joanne stepped onto the porch, balancing a tray with 2 steaming mugs. "You really should read what you sign, Margaret. Would you like some tea?" Karen staggered back a step like the porch had tilted. "I was told the buyer was an LLC, something anonymous." "You deceived me." Walter gave a polite shrug. "You accepted the offer. Didn't even counter." "This is fraud," she hissed. "Manipulation." "It's called legal," Joanne replied, setting down a mug. "Hot cider. Calms the nerves." Across the street, Bev's head popped over her rosebush hedge. "Is everything all right?" she called. "I heard voices, wasn't sure if it was a fire or just fireworks." Karen spun, papers flapping. "This has to be illegal." Bev raised both brows and walked a few steps closer, leash in hand, though her dog had clearly given up any interest in neighborhood drama. "Illegal to buy a home someone put up for sale? You'll have to explain that one." Karen's face flushed crimson, then pale. Behind her, Eli lingered by the mailbox, earbuds unplugged for once. He didn't move closer, but he didn't leave either. His hoodie sleeves were pulled over his hands, one of which absently turned a dry leaf between his fingers. He looked away when Karen caught his eye, and she faltered. Walter watched him a moment longer, then turned back to Karen. "Funny how property lines get real clear when you're holding the deed." Karen's lips trembled. She looked down at the papers again, as if willing the ink to rearrange itself into something less humiliating. Her hand jerked toward her purse, rummaging furiously. "You'll hear from my attorney." The HOA sign was replaced with a banner reading, "Maple Falls Harvest Fair, Community Over Control." It fluttered slightly in the late October breeze, stretched between 2 tall wooden poles anchored in hay bales. The lettering was hand-painted but steady, and someone had tucked orange leaves into the corners for flair. A folding table beneath the sign bore trays of apple slices, jars of cider, and rows of pie squares that looked suspiciously like Bev's handiwork. Walter arrived with Joanne just after noon, both carrying lawn chairs and a thermos of hot cocoa. They set up near the edge of the green, under the long shade of a gnarled maple. Around them, the sounds of the town filtered in, soft laughter, the clink of thermos lids, and the faint melody of a banjo someone had brought purely for ambience. Bev moved through the gathering with the confidence of someone who didn't need a title to be respected. Her apron was dusted with flour, and her smile was easy as she poured cider into paper cups and asked about grandkids, new shingles, or the latest church bake-off. Joanne nudged Walter's elbow. "Funny how quick folks remember their voice once the clipboard goes quiet." Walter didn't say anything. He was too busy watching the former HOA sign being dismantled, letter by letter. A pair of teenagers, neighbors from 3 houses down, were gently unbolting the last of it while humming an old Beatles tune. A small crowd clapped when the last metal came down. No speeches followed. Just a quiet satisfaction that settled over the grass like the shadow of a passing cloud. The old clubhouse, once the seat of Margaret's declarations and disciplinary hearings, stood silent in the background. Its windows were dark, and the "meeting tonight" sign had been flipped backward for over a week. At one point, Bev clinked a spoon against her cider jar and raised her voice just enough. "So, no more titles, but maybe we need someone to collect notes. Coordinate potlucks. Keep things neighborly. No one hesitated. Bev, someone called. Absolutely Bev, another echoed. A ripple of nods and murmured agreements followed. Bev waved it off, modestly, but didn't argue. From across the park, Karen stood by the old stone fountain, her arms folded over a thick wool coat. She wasn't speaking to anyone, nor was anyone approaching. She lingered long enough to catch a few glances, then turned and disappeared down the path without a word. No one called after her. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped just enough to paint the treetops gold, Eli crossed the lawn with something tucked under his arm. Walter was back at the porch by then, sharpening garden shears while Joanne folded up the last of the cider sticky napkins. Eli stopped at the bottom step, looking unsure, then climbed one. "Made this in class," he said, holding out a small black frame. Inside was a photo, taken from a low angle beneath the oak tree, its limbs spread like arms in benediction. The late sunlight filtered through the leaves, giving them a halo. Walter turned it slowly in his hands. "Better than any drone your grandma ever flew," Eli said. Walter smiled. "It's been here through storms," he said softly, "now through HOA." Eli gave a quick nod and turned to go, but there was something softer in his shoulders, something unburdened. Joanne stepped onto the porch and dusted her hands on her jeans. The neighbors had mostly gone home, the last of the cider packed up, and a few carved pumpkins still glowed faintly in the dusk. She looked at Walter, then across the street where Karen's porch sat dark. "Funny. She's the one who planted control, but it's the tree that took root." By the time the last leaf dropped, Margaret had lost her house, her title, and the attention she once demanded. The moving truck pulled away in the hush of early morning. Its diesel rumble faded as it turned the corner and left behind only a rectangle of flattened grass where her SUV used to sit. No neighbors gathered to wave her off. No farewell casseroles. Just the occasional curtain twitch and a crow hopping along the sidewalk, unfazed. Walter stood on the porch, mug in hand, watching the last of the yellow leaves drift from the oak. The branches now stood mostly bare, thin silhouettes against the pewter sky. In the yard below, Joanne knelt at the flower bed, pruning the final bloom of the season, chrysanthemums in a defiant orange. "She wanted to prune our roots," she said over her shoulder. "Turns out, hers weren't that deep." Walter sipped quietly, letting the steam warm his nose. Across the green, the HOA clubhouse door hung ajar. Inside, cardboard boxes lined the hallway. The corkboard once plastered with HOA notices now held only one thumbtack and a faded flyer for a pet costume contest from 5 Octobers ago. Eli appeared mid-morning with a rake slung over one shoulder. He didn't say much, he rarely did, but he joined Walter by the tree and helped gather the last pile of leaves into the wheelbarrow. His movements were slower now, more deliberate, like he was trying to understand the rhythm of the work instead of rushing through it. At noon, Bev arrived with a clipboard, not the HOA kind, just a grocery store variety, and called a small gathering under the oak. Only a few residents came, but no one needed convincing. Her voice was calm, steady, and she outlined a proposal. No more bylaws without a quorum. Any changes require 3 resident signatures. And the clubhouse? It's for everyone now. Not just authorized personnel. Walter nodded. Joanne clapped. Even Eli raised a brow. Later that afternoon, Walter unpacked a wooden plaque from his shed. He wiped off the dust and fastened it to the old post beneath the oak. The letters were burned into the grain, clean and simple, planted in '62, still standing. Joanne leaned over, hands on her hips. Should have added a subtitle. Walter raised an eyebrow. She grinned. And so are we. He laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. As the sun began to fall behind the houses, casting long amber stripes across the lawn, Eli walked up the porch steps carrying something wrapped in brown craft paper. He handed it to Walter wordlessly. Inside was a single oak leaf, pressed flat between 2 panes of glass in a black frame. Below it, in blocky handwriting, a note read, Thank you for letting me stay where people grow things instead of cutting them down. Walter ran his thumb along the edge of the frame, then looked up. You're staying with Bev? Eli nodded. She said I could keep my room. Said it's quieter there now. Feels better. Joanne brought out a watering can and began tending the flower bed again, careful not to spill on her sneakers. She glanced at the plaque, then the nearly bare oak, then the boy now helping Walter secure the frame to the porch wall. Think the tree knows it won? Every Saturday, neighbors gather under the oak tree, for muffins, coffee, and stories about the woman who tried to trim the world. The mornings start slow, as they should. Folding chairs appear on the lawn like mushrooms after rain, some creaky and patched, others brand new but already stained with stories. A table borrowed from the church hosts a rotating spread of baked goods, muffins, banana bread, scones, none of it store-bought, all of it passed hand to hand with warmth. Walter sets out the percolator by 9 o'clock. Joanne makes sure the cream isn't powdered and the sugar is in a proper bowl, not packets. Bev arrives with a clipboard, an ironic nod now, used only for tallying who brings what and when they'll meet next. They don't speak of Margaret much. When they do, it's with a strange fondness, like she was a storm they weathered together. A marker on the calendar. A lesson with a name. Walter once said it best to a young couple new to Maple Falls. The HOA era, he mused, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs. Let's just say it ended under this tree. The couple had laughed politely, but the story stuck. It always did. Later that week, the community gathered again, not on a Saturday, but a Thursday afternoon, for something a little more permanent. Bev had organized the whole thing. A local woodworker carved the sign, Joanne painted the trim. Children helped lay the mulch. The plaque stood proudly at the corner park, right beside the playground where the old HOA bulletin board used to loom. It read, "Community over control. Dedicated to those who stood firm." The crowd clapped, not because someone told them to, but because the moment asked for it. Eli helped Walter dig a small hole near the oak. Not close enough to compete for roots, but close enough to belong. Together, they lowered a sapling, still gangly, barely shoulder-high, its tag flapping in the wind. Silver maple, Eli said. Fast-growing. Friendly. Walter patted the soil gently around the base. Good shade tree someday. Eli smiled. It already is. Back on the porch that evening, Joanne sat with a stack of mail and a soft cardigan wrapped around her shoulders. She held up a letter, cream-colored and neatly addressed in slanted handwriting. From Helen Parsons. Moved to Texas last spring. She opened it slowly, carefully, and read aloud. You gave this place its soul back. When I saw the pictures, I cried a little, not because of what was gone, but because of what stayed. Walter didn't reply right away. He was watching the oak. Its bark was darkened from a recent drizzle, and the last few golden leaves clung to the high branches like thoughts not yet spoken. This wasn't about a yard or a tree, he said quietly. It was about choosing peace, and planting it. The wind shifted. Across the way, someone turned on porch lights. The soft glow settled like a blanket over the houses, over the lawn, over the small silver maple just beginning its journey. As the neighbors dispersed, Mandy from the diner walked by with her usual evening stroll coffee. She raised a hand in greeting, then nodded toward the tree with a grin. You know, she said, folks are calling it the tree that took down an HOA. As the seasons changed and the last leaves settled beneath the old oak, Maple Falls found something stronger than rules, connection. A quiet stand beneath a towering tree reminded the neighborhood that real authority comes not from clipboards, but from courage, decency, and shared roots. When a community listens, stands together, and remembers what truly matters, even the loudest enforcers fade into silence. Like a tree planted deep and wide, resilience doesn't shout, it simply grows.